Hello, this is Rebecca Kling, the Community Storytelling Advocate at the National Center for Transgender Equality. This is the March 1st evening webinar on advocacy training, particularly around advocating for and with trans youth in schools. For those of you who don't know me, as I said, I am Rebecca, and I want to give you a little bit of info about myself so you know who you're listening to. Before I joined NCTE, I worked in Chicago as a performance artist and an educator. So I toured my own work as well as working with colleges and universities and theater festivals around the country. My background is in theater and is in storytelling, which is part of why I love sharing these tools with parents and advocates so y'all can help share your stories. I also love working with youth. I have a background as a theater teacher, and I'm now on the leadership team with Camp Aranutic, which is a wonderful camp for trans and gender variant youth, and this upcoming summer will be my 6th summer with them. I am trans myself. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm really excited to be sharing with y'all tonight and to hopefully have some good questions, some good information. I'm taking notes if people have questions that I don't know the answer to. I am not a lawyer. I am not a policy wonk. So I will answer as much as I can tonight, but if there are very specific or targeted questions, I may say I'll get back to you. Going over our agenda for tonight, we're going to talk a little bit about the background that goes into why we talk about issues these ways, and then some updates on the latest news around trans youth issues. I'm going to share a little bit on telling your story and on how to speak with reporters or others in an interview setting. This is stuff that I cover a lot in the story training and media prep webinars that I do. So those of you who have participated in those, that might be a little info you've seen before, and hopefully you'll get something new this time. For those who haven't, I do dive a lot deeper into that. So if that's something you're particularly interested in or curious about, I'm happy to share that training material with you later. We're then going to talk about how to work with schools, as well as how to work more broadly across the state, and what are next steps both for you all as advocates and for NCTE. A little bit of fine print at the beginning. You are speaking on your own behalf, so you are not an NCTE representative. We want you to be sharing your stories. We want you to be advocating. We don't yet have any sort of speakers bureau or sort of official way to get you out into the world. So for right now, you're just speaking on your own behalf. You're welcome to say that you received some training from NCTE, but that you're not speaking for NCTE. And because I'm a sucker for visual jokes, this is a fine print joke, and this is a joke in the fine print. For those of you just listening on audio, you're going to just have to wonder what that joke in the fine print was, or watch the video later. A little bit about messaging background, and this is something that you don't need to memorize, you don't need to think too deeply about, but I find it interesting and a little bit helpful to frame things. So when we think about who we want to reach, we can think about this universe where there are allies on the one end and opponents on the other. And allies are people who are strongly on our side. Everyone on this call who's an ally, I would hope, would be in this camp. And this is something I'm really fortunate that I can count my parents as allies, and that there is no TV ad or politician or religious leader who could convince them to stop supporting trans rights. On the other end, we have our opponents, and these are people we definitely want to win over eventually. Probably not going to win them over today, probably not tomorrow, maybe not even the next couple years. So when we think about where we want to really push our stories and our focus, we want to think about that movable middle. These are people who haven't thought a ton about LGBT rights or trans rights in specific. So there's a lot of education and story connection we can do with this movable middle to reach them. And when we talk about the movable middle, these are folks who are grounded in a desire to support. What I mean by that is when we ask if LGBT people or if trans people should have protections, they generally say yes. They'll say, yeah, you shouldn't be able to fire someone for being trans. You shouldn't be able to treat a student differently because they're gay. They think discrimination is wrong, and this movable middle really wants to be good people. They want to do the right thing. But when we push them on that, on how to support LGBT people or trans students, it gets a little complicated because they haven't thought a ton about LGBT people. And in particular, they often have these contradictory expectations. And what I mean by that is they sometimes project the problem onto LGBT people. So they'll say, well, of course you should be able to come out and be who you are, but maybe if you didn't act so gay, it wouldn't be a problem. Or, of course a trans student shouldn't be bullied because they're trans, but expecting other people to get it is unfair. So they say, yes, you shouldn't be discriminated against on the one hand, but it's a little bit your fault for being out there on the other hand. And in particular, this group struggles with identifying and empathizing because they might not know anyone who's out as a trans person. They might not have anyone in their family or friend group who's out as a trans person or an LGBT person. And this group also tends to minimize or dismiss stories of harm. And what I mean by that is if someone is fired for being trans, someone in the movable middle might say, that's awful. Of course you should never be fired, but I don't know that we need new laws. Or if a child is bullied for being gay, they'll say, of course that's bad. Of course bullying is wrong. But that doesn't mean we need a new policy or that we need some sort of special training. And when we talk about trans people in particular, this movable middle has some very specific concerns. First, they have a really binary idea of what gender is. Men are over here, women are over there. Moving across that is really confusing. And the idea of people who are non-binary or gender non-conforming or gender fluid it can be a real struggle for people in the movable middle who maybe have never connected with someone like that. The movable middle might also just have a stereotype of who trans people are. At best, this group might have learned about trans people from Orange is the New Black or from Modern Family. And at worst, this group might have learned about trans people from Jerry Springer or from politicians saying mean things about trans people. So we really want to reach this group to give them first just the facts, as well as sort of this emotional connection to what it means to be trans or to be the parent of a trans person or an advocate for trans people. Now, a lot of the stuff we're talking about today is heavy. So one of the ways I try to deal with that is cute pictures of animals. So throughout this, there are going to be some cute pictures of animals, and I highly encourage those on the phone to find a website that has cute pictures of animals so you can share along. All right. So the first thing I want to get into is those news updates. First about Title IX. And Title IX, I have learned a lot about in the last couple of weeks, and the way Title IX is being talked about these days is a little nuanced. So I want to go through what exactly some of this means. Title IX is a 1972 law that says sex discrimination in educational institutions that receive federal funding is against the law. Now, almost all educational institutions receive some amount of federal funding, even if they're private. So Title IX is a really powerful way to work with schools and to make sure that students are being treated equally. And since 1972, courts have increasingly found, particularly in the last decade or so, that Title IX covers LGBT students. And what that means is the court is saying, if you discriminate against a student because they're gay, or if you discriminate a student because they're trans, at its core, that is sex discrimination because it is making expectations about sex stereotypes, either that everyone's straight or everyone's cisgender, meaning not transgender. So more and more courts are saying Title IX does protect LGBT people and that discriminating against LGBT students falls under that larger umbrella of sex discrimination. In 2016, the Department of Education under President Obama issued guidance saying explicitly, yes, Title IX should be read by schools as covering LGBT students. And if you are discriminating against LGBT students, and trans students in particular, you are in violation of Title IX. Now again, this didn't change the law itself. The law itself still says sex discrimination. But the Department of Education was saying our reading of this as the Department of Ed is that LGBT people are included under that. And then last week, the Department of Education under Betsy DeVos, along with the Department of Justice under Jeff Sessions, removed that guidance. Again, they didn't change the law itself. The law itself still says sex discrimination, and more courts are saying sex discrimination includes anti-LGBT discrimination. But It's unclear how the Office of Civil Rights under the Trump administration will enforce Title IX and what their attitude about Title IX is going to be. This ties into something else that we've talked a lot about in the last couple of weeks, which is Gavin Grimm. Now, Gavin is a trans young man from Virginia, and he is currently suing, along with help from the ACLU, the Gloucester County School Board in Virginia. And what that means is Gavin was denied using the boys' restroom. He and his family, and with support from the ACLU, sued the school district. And a number of courts along the way, it's gone slowly up the chain, have said, yes, what you did to Gavin, denying Gavin the ability to use the boys' room, violates Title IX. And it made it all the way up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is going to hear it on March 28th, and we're expecting a ruling sometime in June. Originally, the Supreme Court was going to consider two questions. The first one was, should courts defer or listen to the Department of Education? Meaning, when the Department of Education said Title IX includes LGBT people, should the court take that as law, or does the court need to decide on its own? That question has gone away because the Department of Education is no longer saying Title IX protects LGBT people. But the more fundamental question of, does Title IX protect LGBT people, is still going to be answered. So hopefully, the Supreme Court can always throw us for a loop. So hopefully, by the end of June, the Supreme Court will have ruled in our favor, and by our, I mean the trans community, saying that discriminating against a trans student is sex discrimination and does violate Title IX. Any questions about any of that? I don't think it's important that you know all of the nitty-gritty details about that. The most important thing I would say is that the law has not changed in the last week. It absolutely sucks and is frustrating and is a really bad sign that the Department of Education rescinded that guidance. And I understand that there are a lot of parents concerned about that and a lot of trans students concerned about that. It doesn't change the law itself, and NCTE's position, and we hope the courts will agree, is that Title IX still protects trans students. There is a question from the text, will Gorsuch be approved as a new justice before the decision on Gavin Grimm? Do you know? I do not know the answer to that. I know the hearings for Justice Gorsuch are supposed to be before. I don't know if it's realistic that Justice Gorsuch would be sworn in before the 28th, and I'm going to admit my ignorance on that, so I'm going to make a note with that, and I will follow up. So give me 1 second. Okay. Any other questions specifically about Title IX or about Gavin Grimm's case? All right. So now I want to spend a little bit of time talking about how you can share your story and why that's so important. And the reason that's so important is because, again, a lot of people out there don't know if they've ever met a trans person. They might have, but that trans person might not have been out. In particular, they may never have met a trans child, and so they might have a very flawed or wrong idea, or just very ignorant, and I don't mean that negatively, I mean that to mean they don't have a lot of knowledge about trans people. So stories are an incredibly important way, and I mean stories that you can tell to each other, or at PTA meetings, or to politicians, or to news media. When you're thinking about a story, the first thing I want you to think about is, whose story are you telling? Are you telling your story about being a parent? Are you telling your child's story about being a trans person? Are you telling your community's story about a journey that your community learned how to support trans people better? Or as a teacher, you've seen trans people move through your school and how support has been important. Connected with that, I want you to think about how other members of your family and of your community are impacted by those stories. So if you tell your trans child's story, if you have another child who's not trans, how are they going to be impacted? How are they going to feel at school? What is that going to mean for their social circle? Again, it doesn't mean don't tell your stories. I love stories, and I love hearing when parents and advocates tell their stories, but it's something that I want you to think about before rather than after. Similarly, if you are telling your child's story, particularly as that child starts to get older, think about whether or not they should be telling their own story. There are definitely trans young people out there who say, I'm 16, I'm 17, I'm 18, I could tell my own story, I don't really want to, but it's okay for you, parent, mom, dad, whomever, to tell my story for me. I give you that permission, that's great. There are other trans young people out there who might say, well, actually, I would rather tell my story than you tell it for me. And that's something that we want to make sure to respect, because we want to be working with trans communities, not for trans communities. The other things I want you to think about before you share a story is, why are you telling it, and what do you want from your audience? And what I mean by that is, we tell stories for lots of different reasons. We tell stories to make friends. We tell stories to emotionally connect. We tell stories for catharsis and to feel better. We also tell stories for advocacy. And if you are telling a story to a politician or to a journalist or to a PTA, you're telling it because you want to get something from them. You want them to vote a certain way, or you want them to support a certain policy. Or it might be even much, much smaller. You want them to stop misgendering or mispronouncing your child. Or you want them to support you when you go to the school district. And those are different things that you want from your audience than if you were telling a story at an open mic, or if you were telling a story at a family reunion. And it doesn't mean that one is better than the other. It's that I want you to make sure you're thinking through, what do you need from your audience? And then how do you construct that story itself? Again, I do a much longer workshop just on this, so I'm not going to get into too much detail. The broad thing that I like is this framework of introducing yourself, sharing your story, connecting that story to trans rights, and then linking back to the why you thought about beforehand. Why are you telling your story, and what do you want from your audience? And in particular, when you introduce yourself, explaining your connection to transgender rights. For some of us, this is really simple. I'm Rebecca, I'm transgender. My mom might say, I'm Bonnie, my daughter is transgender. It might also mean that you have students who are trans, or there are trans people in your community. And it's helpful for the audience then to know, why is this person telling this story? I would also say that introduction is a great place to explain your terms. So a lot of people don't know what transgender or transitioning or sex assigned at birth or hormone replacement therapy or medical transition or legal transition. They don't know what those terms mean. And that's okay. So if I'm using those words in a story, I want to make sure I explain them as soon and as simply as possible. The story itself, I want you to think about what is one clear and concise story. It should have a beginning, middle, and end, and it should really clearly show how and why trans rights are important. A story from my life I sometimes tell is about being fired for being transgender, and that's a really specific story that I can give, and then in part 3, I can link that to, that's why it's so important that we have non-discrimination policies so that trans people are judged on their job performance, not their identity. And that very last part then is sort of the cherry on top. I've introduced myself, I've told my story, I've explained why that story connects to trans rights, and then the very last thing I'm going to do is say what I want from my audience. And that's why you need to vote, or why you need to support your trans coworkers, or why you need to call your politicians. There's a ton of different things that that can do. Again, this is not the only way to tell a story, but it's a simple way to remember to sort of hit all your bases for advocacy. You want to make sure you're connecting with your audience, explaining your terms, linking that story to trans rights, and giving your audience a very specific thing that you need from them to do. Any questions on that before we move on to interview prep? All right. So a couple things about interviews. Interviews, I mean anytime someone can ask you questions. So this might be a politician in an office meeting with them as a constituent. This might be a more traditional thing we think of as interview with a reporter. Some general notes. Think about your audience. You can always ask questions of them, particularly reporters, ahead of time. Have you worked with the LGBT community before? Can you send me the type of questions you're thinking of? Who else are you speaking with? That can tell you a lot. If they're only speaking with trans allies, that's probably going to be a much more positive story than if they're also speaking with people who are against trans rights. Being polite helps. This can be really frustrating because our opponents are not always polite. People against trans rights are not always nice to us. But it helps reflect better on us and gives us more leverage if we're able to stay polite. Take your time. This is something that, unless you are in a live interview, you are allowed to ask for a moment to think about a question. You're allowed to say, actually, I want to pause for a second because I really want to answer that carefully. You're also allowed to connect and redirect. And this is something anyone who has young children or works with children knows about, even if you haven't called it that. This is something I get from summer camp. If a camper comes up to me and says, I don't want to go to this activity, engaging in that might distract us from actually getting to the activity. So I might say something like, that's really hard that you don't want to do this activity. It's a bummer that you don't want to go to arts and crafts right now. I'm connecting, I'm validating, I'm not telling them that they're dumb or wrong or stupid, but then I'm going to redirect. So tell me about your bunkmates. Are you excited for the campfire tonight? What are you going to do at the talent show? If I'm talking with a politician or with a reporter, I can still do that. If they are asking a question that is rude, a question that is inappropriate, or a question that's just outside of what I'm there to talk about. If someone asks me about whether or not I've had surgery, if I'm there to talk about non-discrimination protection for employers, I might say, you know, I understand that's a question a lot of people have. Actually, right now I'm here to talk about whatever, non-discrimination protection. So again, you're not saying that the question is dumb, but you're steering back towards what your focus is. I would also encourage you to think about your level of expertise. There are definitely questions that I get that I say, you know, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm going to check with our policy team and get back to you. And I definitely encourage you to say, that's a really great question. I want to connect you with someone at NCTE or HRC or ACLU or any of the other great organizations out there so I can make sure you're getting the right information. And last but not least, sometimes we need to wrap things up early. And what I mean by that is, hopefully this will never happen to you, but if a reporter or if a politician or if another parent at a meeting or a teacher or a school administrator is being so rude and so frustrating that you know you're not getting anything done, sometimes the answer is, okay, thank you for your time, we're done here. And I want to give you permission to say no if something isn't working. Some other things I would say steer away from. Again, there's no one-size-fits-all, but these are the types of things we've seen get people over-the-top language or name-calling. Calling someone a jerk, swearing, those are the types of things that, with narrow exceptions, I would discourage. I would also say big, sweeping statements. Nobody cares more about bathroom safety than trans people. All trans people have experienced blank. Everyone knows XYZ. There's never been an issue with this because it then becomes really easy for our opponents to come back and say, well, you said nobody cares more and I found someone who cares more. Or you said all trans people have experienced and I found someone who didn't. And so we want to avoid those big over-the-top statements because it can get us into trouble. I would also say avoiding language that minimizes or dismisses anxiety. This is what I said earlier. It feels really bad, in addition to being non-productive, to say things like, well, bathroom safety actually isn't a big deal. Or, well, I don't understand what you're worried about. Your worry, it just isn't helpful. Again, the worry may be unrealistic, but it is a real worry that that person has. And it is never helpful to call someone's fear dumb or wrong. Finally, I would say be really careful when making comparisons about different movements. So this is something that you'll sometimes hear someone say, the trans rights movement is just like the civil rights movement, or the fight for bathroom access now is just like it was for people of color in the 60s. And there are a couple of reasons I would say generally avoid this. The first one is not all of us have the identity to make that comparison authentically. Using myself for an example, I am a white woman born in the North, in Chicago, in the mid-'80s. It is false and inappropriate for me to make a comparison between my struggle and the civil rights struggle. It doesn't mean we can say there are lessons we can learn, we can say our opponents are using similar tactics, we can totally learn from other civil rights movements, but I would be really, really careful before making some explicit comparisons. Any questions about any of that while I put up a giraffe? Giraffes are amazing and the most ridiculous animals. The more I learn about them, the more absurd they are. And I really encourage going looking for videos of baby giraffes in particular. All right. Sometimes when we're communicating with people, when we're advocating, we are asked uncomfortable questions. For a trans person, this might mean, have you had the surgery? Or who do you date? Or what is sex like? For a parent of a trans person, it might be, is your child on hormones? Or when is your child having surgery? Or what was your child's real name? Now again, it doesn't mean that those are dumb questions, but they can be rude or uncomfortable. And I would say there are 3 ways to answer any uncomfortable question. The first one is to deflect. And what I mean by that is if someone asks me if I've had surgery, I might say, well, actually, I'm here to talk about non-discrimination protection and not here to talk about my surgical status. So I am entirely shutting down that line of questioning. The next would be a partial response. And this I might say, you know, some trans people have surgery and some don't. And it's important that everyone is protected by non-discrimination laws. So I'm answering the question for the community. Some people do, some people don't. There's no right way to be trans. But I'm not answering it for myself. And the last one is to answer it yourself. Have you had the surgery? Yes, I have. And what I like about these is it depends entirely on context. There are totally times when a friend or a doctor or someone I'm dating might ask me personal questions, and it would be appropriate for me to answer. Similarly, there are times where I might want to be polite and respond to the deeper question, so I might want to give that partial response. And then finally, there are times when I just want to shut it down. And the way I like to think about this is, does this person need to know? And is there reciprocity? Meaning if they ask the question of me, can I ask the question of them? And most of the time, again, not always, but most of the time, people do not need to know, and there is not that sense of reciprocity. If someone asks me whether I've had surgery, I will sometimes turn that around and say, well, what's between your legs? And it's that reciprocity part. Now I want to give some specific examples. If someone asks, is your child on hormones? A way to totally shut that down would be, actually, I'm not here to talk about that. I'm here to discuss supporting transgender students. And that's deflecting it and getting it back on track. The middle one, the sort of partial response, well, some trans people do this, other trans people do that. And then the final way, the sort of fully answer would be, yes, my child is on hormones. In fact, and then you can give more information. And only you know which of those is appropriate in any given situation, but it's helpful a little bit to think ahead of time, okay, if I go into this interview and they ask me about this, and I'm happy to brainstorm later or offline, if they ask me about my child's hormone status, if they ask me about legal changes, if they ask me about my extended family, if they ask me about my religious community, how do I want to answer those questions? And there's no right or wrong answer as long as it's something that you're comfortable with, that your child is comfortable with, and that isn't going to harm other trans people somehow. And what I mean by that is if you say, my child is transitioning correctly, and those other trans kids aren't. So there you're answering a question for your child, but you're also somehow negatively speaking about other members of the community, and we don't want to do that. Any questions about any of that before we move into school level advocacy? And again, there's a lot more of that I go into in the story training and media prep workshop. So when we talk about school level advocacy, there are some things we can think about in general that are going to be true no matter what school your child is in or you're working at, and no matter what policies exist. The first one is, remember to keep trans people in the loop around these conversations, particularly trans youth. There was a bit of a pushback from the community recently because a lot of people were using the hashtag #ProtectTransYouth. And there was a response from some trans young people saying, well, actually we want you to work with us, not just protect us. And some of these trans young people who are, again, 16, 17, 18, are able to advocate for themselves, are able to speak for themselves, and so don't necessarily need our protection so much as us working with them. This is also really true because different schools and different communities might have different issues. One community might have great policies, but no one's following them. Another community might have no policies, but the staff is all really great, so the policies part is less important than being able to change your name on a document or gender-neutral bathrooms. And so engaging with that community, whether it's your child or whether it's other young people at that school or young people in that community, is really important. The other thing I like to think about is the carrot and the stick. And what I mean by that, the carrot is appealing to the higher ideals of education, of trying to encourage teachers and administrators to remember the sort of golden ideal of teaching, that we want all of our children to succeed, and that includes trans children. And this is something that if a parent or a teacher or an educator is in that movable middle part, trying to get them to think about how morally valuable this is, and I mean that seriously, can be helpful. That's the carrot. The other part is the stick. And this is, again, something that I can't tell you if is right for your situation, but sometimes ultimately, as Gavin Grimm saw, and as some young trans women in Pennsylvania we're going to talk about a little later saw, sometimes lawsuits are appropriate, and I don't think should ever be the first solution or the first attempt, but definitely are something to remember can be an option. All right, and here's a rat holding an Easter egg. I don't usually think of, it might be a mouse, I actually don't know, but I don't usually think of rodents as cute. This is a pretty cute rodent, so just a little reminder, cuteness can come in all types. The next thing I want to talk about a little bit is what a model policy might look like. So let's say a school comes to you and says, we really want to do this, we want to support trans students, we don't know what the policies should be. GLSEN has come out with a phenomenal model policy that I will email to everyone after. So they go into much more detail, but giving you a little bit of info. The first thing is thinking about the scope. The ideal policy covers everything from students to teachers to interactions with the community. In particular, a couple of places we would want a policy to touch on. Bullying and harassment and discrimination are sort of the most obvious ones, and that's what a lot of parents think immediately when they think about protecting trans students in school. That's a really important part. And most schools already have some policies around these, so it's usually expanding them rather than writing them. The next is thinking about privacy and confidentiality. If a student comes out to a teacher, that should not be reported to the parents unless there are other privacy, unless there are other health or safety issues. We don't want to turn parents into, or we don't want to turn teachers rather, into mandatory reporters for their students' trans status or sexual orientation. This can also be a helpful reminder for schools because under, I think it's FERPA, which is similar to HIPAA, which we all know around health information, there's a similar law that protects education information. And so if a child comes out to a school, it's arguably then against the law for the school to reveal that information without the family's consent. Again, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm happy to follow up with our policy team for more specifics, but we want to think about privacy and confidentiality. And then thinking about how that school is going to talk to the media and to the community. Are they using language that's inclusive of trans students? Are they using language that is respectful of the LGBT community and really includes the LGBT community? How can students change their names and pronouns in school records? And what we would say is, while there might be restrictions on what can be changed in sort of the permanent record, attendance sheets should absolutely be changeable without a legal name change. That if your child has a name and a pronoun that they go by, even if there's been no legal changes, the school should change that. Similarly, we want to be able to change school records in a way that's going to respect and support students. The other big one that most people think about these days, in addition to bullying and harassment, is that access to gender segregated stuff. And that's bathrooms and locker rooms and sports teams, that sort of thing. And we would say that trans students absolutely should be not only allowed, but encouraged to participate in whatever their identified gender activities are. Similarly for dress code. And then the last thing we would want a model policy to have, or a perfect policy to have, is information on how to support students who are transitioning at school. Because it's a different situation if a student moves to a new school and has transitioned previously. There are definitely concerns there of how the school can support that student, but there are different concerns than if a student is transitioning at a school. And so we want policies that support that too. A couple of other things to think about. It's really important to have community engagement in this, but that shouldn't give the community the opportunity to attack trans students. So ideally, in a perfect world, and I know we are not in a perfect world, you would want to get the administration on your side and help them hold conversations that are going to allow people with concerns to express those concerns, and for those concerns to be addressed in a way that puts them to bed, to say, this is the position, this is where we are, we have heard you and respect those concerns, and this is what we're doing about it. Similarly, a perfect policy would have space for professional development and for teachers and administrators to learn more and how to better support students. And finally, there would be consequences for not living up to that policy. That can be really frustrating to have what feels like an amazing policy, but no one's following it and no one seems to care. So as I said, I'm going to send, those resources out around the model policy, so that goes into a lot more detail. Some other things to think about that anyone can do no matter what your district or what your school is like. And the big one is continue to educate. And I would say connecting with allies. So thinking about who can I meet with, who can I give some of this information to, and how do I repeat that? Even if it's just one teacher who seems supportive, how do I get them on my side and work with them so that they can educate others and we can support each other? And that schools and districts may be able to do better even if there aren't supportive policies. So even if there isn't a policy that the school district is willing to implement, the principal at your school or your child's teacher might still be able to do something about it. Similarly, if you have other parents who you're able to ally with, even if their children aren't trans, being able to come together as a dozen parents saying we need this rather than as one parent can be powerful as well. And I would say then please stay connected with NCTE. We are working on more resources like this and more ways to connect parents and family advocates with each other. And we're hoping to have some announcements about that in the next couple of weeks. So I would say, again, please stay connected with us and with other organizations. So now I want to talk a little bit about what can you do in districts that are already supportive. So they have good policies, they have good training, they have good staff. The first thing I would say is thank educators and administrators. And something that came up in the webinar this afternoon that I'm working on is someone asked for a template of maybe how to do that. Because we want to encourage people who are doing the right thing, politicians, administrators, educators, to keep doing the right thing. And I can tell you from having been a teacher that it's really powerful to get feedback from parents saying that something I'm doing is working. Continue to speak out at city council meetings and school board meetings and letters to the editor and on social media so that, again, it stays clear that not only was this policy or this position put in place, but there are still people who find it important so that it doesn't happen and then no one follows up on it. I would also say think about pushing those educators or those administrators or those politicians for public statements. And this was another thing we talked about this afternoon that I want to try and put together a template, and if anyone has one, please send it my way for how to do that. So saying, hey, it's amazing that you support us. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Can you say a public statement about it? Could you write a letter to the editor of the local paper? Could you issue a proclamation on behalf of LGBT students? There are endless ways to do that. And now you're not only amplifying your voice, but you're encouraging other allies to amplify theirs. The last thing that's actually not the last thing, the second to last thing I would think of is what's happening outside of schools. Are there extracurriculars that you can also talk to the staff? Are there YMCAs or Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts or religious organizations that your child or other children in the community are also engaging in? And how do you push for change there too? And the last thing I would say is don't get complacent. Because there's a policy today doesn't mean that it'll be there tomorrow, and we want to make sure that supportive districts and supportive educators and politicians are staying supportive. Any questions or thoughts on that? So what if your district is somewhere in the middle? And by that I mean they might not have any anti-trans policies, but they also don't have any policies that are specifically supporting trans students. So right off the bat, push for those policies that are explicitly protecting trans students. And again, GLSEN has resources of what model policies look like, so you and your school district doesn't have to reinvent the wheel. Finding your allies here is also really important so that you're not going this fight alone. And again, that's something we're trying to connect people with and we want to continue to do. And I would say, again, continue to speak out in all of those other ways. Letters to the editor, op-eds, at PTA meetings, at school board meetings, even with other parents when it's not explicitly political. If you're at a play group and someone says something about, oh, those trans bathroom laws, chime on. That's not a sentence. Chime in. I tried to combine speak up with chime in. Speak in and chime up. I think that's the real lesson for tonight. And the unsupportive districts, I would say the broad idea of continuing to push and continuing to speak out is the same, but it's going to be a little bit different because there's something that's already negative. And I think I'm going to write this down. The theme for today is speak in and chime up. And I like that Betsy is on the team chime up and speak in. So when a school has an unsupportive policy or a district or a state, you want to remind them that they're on the wrong side of the law, that Title IX has been found more and more to protect trans students and more that sex discrimination includes anti-LGBT discrimination, and that other laws about providing a safe school, about making sure students aren't bullied, about making sure that every child receives a safe and competent education. Even if the word trans or LGBT isn't in any of those laws, you still may be able to make a case that my child as a trans person is being discriminated against because they're not being supported the way other students are. And then going back to that carrot, they're also on the wrong side of what's right. They are failing to protect and support all of their students. And schools have both a moral responsibility and a legal responsibility to support all of their students, not just the students the principal or the administration or the politicians happen to like. I would say finding allies is even more important in this situation so that you aren't going it alone. And in particular, allies are helpful after something happens too. And what I mean by that is a lot of the time we think about how to prepare for things. How do I prepare for the school board meeting? How do I prepare to go talk to my legislator? But how do you prepare to be done doing that? And what I mean is it can be really exciting to win and then overwhelming to feel like, okay, well now I'm alone in this win. So having people to celebrate your victories can be important. And similarly, it can be really disheartening and it can be really painful to lose. And so being able to have people to commiserate with and to have a shoulder to cry on and to vent and then to plan next steps. And please, please, please continue to speak out. One of the biggest shifts for when people support trans people is when they know trans people. So if you are speaking out as a trans person or as the parent of a trans person or as a peer or ally or friend of trans people, it makes a huge difference. Betsy is asking, how can we find unsupportive districts near us so we can show up at school board meetings and make a statement? I love that. And I'm going to write that down. That goes back for me to something I know NCTE is working on. So first, there are a ton of amazing closed parent groups on Facebook that I am not a part of because I am not a parent, but I have talked to parents of trans people who say those groups are great ways to connect with each other. And so if you know you are open to driving an hour or so, it might be worth to connect with one of those groups and saying, hey, I'm in DC, but I'm happy to drive anywhere within an hour or two of DC and speak at a school board meeting. Or, hey, I'm in this place where there's not a supportive policy, anyone in the area able to come to this next school board meeting? And NCTE has some stuff we're hoping we'll be able to help with this soon. Rebecca was giving a +1 to that question. And then Kimberly was saying, would emphasizing what is developmentally appropriate for all students helpful? It was a phrase they used constantly in early childhood ed in the early 2000s. Is that a thing? That's something that I would actually love if other educators have a sense of. My teaching was not in public school. I was doing after-school theater classes, so I don't have the background, and I'm certainly not a current teacher. I would say thinking about developmental appropriate is something that can be helpful because teachers and parents and students can get, students less so, administrators can get scared of talking about sex, big air quotes. And so reminding them that we already talk about gender. We always are saying in classrooms, all right, boys and girls, listen up. All right, boys line up for the bathroom. All right, girls line up for the bathroom. All right, boys and girls, what did you do this weekend? We constantly use the language around gender. And in play, kids are talking about gender. In stories, books are talking about gender. And so absolutely saying, this is not something new that we want to talk about. This is something that our kids and our teachers are already talking about, and we want to make sure all of our students are included. One of the questions that came up this afternoon that I want to mention, and I'm working on some language around, and I would love if other people have thoughts, is what do you do if a school doesn't want to, if a school says, well, we need to stay neutral on this, or a school says, well, we don't want to be political about this. Now, I would say that protecting all students is a responsibility of a school and that neutrality is not. But I would love to hear if other people have thoughts on how to respond to that. And I'm going to talk with the rest of our communications team here and see if we can come up with some language, because I know that that's something that also can be really frustrating to feel like schools are sort of sidestepping the issue by saying it's not something they want to deal with. Betsy was saying, talk about the importance of safe learning environment where kids are safe to focus on learning. Absolutely. We want to make sure our schools are safe for all students, including trans students. We don't want special rights. We don't want special privileges. We want to have the same access to education as everyone else. And a couple of specific, oh, I'm in the wrong window. A couple of specific talking points that can be helpful. And again, I will email these later so you don't need to memorize them, but to go over sort of the types of things. First one is saying that other people are doing it and it's working out. Over 40%, so almost half of K-12 students, are in schools that have affirming state or local policies, and that number is growing. So this is not new. This is not something that's coming out of the blue. This is not something that is untested or untried. And that this is supported by tons of professional organizations. And again, Betsy asked if these stats are for public schools, or public and private. I don't know, and I'm going to look into that. In terms of organizations that support trans students, this can be really helpful. So I'm going to read off a ton, and I'll send you this list later. You don't need to memorize it. Organizations who have supported trans students include the American Association of Secondary School Principals, the National Association of Elementary School Principals, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the National Association of School Psychologists, the American Counselors Association, the National Parent-Teacher Association, the National Education Association, and the American Federation of Teachers. And some of those actually asked the Department of Ed for the guidance that Trump rescinded. So when you saw, if you heard Sean Spicer or others say this guidance was unasked for, that's simply not true. Some of these organizations were asking for this guidance. Jess said, is there a list of books that are divided into age groups to bring to our kids' schools to help with gender-inclusive conversation? A list for educators as well. I know that there are, Jess, and I'm going to look into that as well. And I would say, if any of you on this call have books or resources that you found particularly helpful, please send them my way, and I will gladly share those out. It can also be helpful to say that research shows when trans students are supported and affirmed, they thrive. They succeed at just the same rate as everyone else. But when they are not affirmed and supported, they have greater mental health challenges. They are less likely to graduate. They're more likely to drop out. They're more likely to be homeless. And then as adults, not surprisingly, that translates to a whole host of issues. so that this is not an abstract issue. This is a very real issue about how we support students. And Betsy was saying there's a consultant in Massachusetts who has a great list, and that sounds great. I would love it, Betsy, if you could share that with anyone. Any other questions about this stuff, or any other thoughts or brainstorming items? Any other resources you wish you had that maybe other people on this have, or that I can look into and see if we can find? So I want to take a little bit time now to zoom out. So you're working with your school, you're working with the district, and now you're trying to zoom out a little bit and work at that state level. So first, let's see where we are. There are 14 states, and I'll send you the list, that have explicit trans-supportive education guidance. There are additional states that may have other laws or policies that protect trans students. So, and someone just asked about materials in Spanish. That is a place that we don't have as much as I wish. So I'm absolutely going to look into resources in Spanish, and will make it a priority to try and find what we can, as well as thinking about how do we translate some of this into Spanish. So thank you for bringing that up, and for that reminder. And so going back, what I mean by other protections is Illinois, which is where I'm from, so I'm most familiar with some of those laws. Illinois has an anti-discrimination law that includes trans people and LGBT people, but it's not explicitly about education. It's just a general non-discrimination law. It applies to education. So in a state like Illinois, even though there isn't an explicit education law, trans students are still protected at the state level, and there are other states like that as well. And then there are a bunch of states that have no explicit policy one way or the other, and a few states, most notably North Carolina, that have explicitly anti-trans laws. And someone was chiming in last night. There was a policy in New Jersey last night where an explicitly inclusive and protective policy was voted down last night. So where do we go from here in getting policy back on the table and passed? And I would say that the real answer is organizing at a whole bunch of levels. So that means thinking about how do you educate the community? How do you have conversations? How do you connect with some of the parents or some of the educators who are concerned or skeptical or against it? Also then thinking about those politicians. Are any of them up for re-election? Are any of them movable? Are any of them voting because they had wrong information or misunderstood the issue? And then thinking about what are the actual steps? Is there a ballot initiative? Is there a way to reintroduce it in the city council? Is there a way to introduce it in a way that addresses some of the concerns? And this is the longer work that can be frustrating, to do and draining to engage in, and is also incredibly, incredibly important. So I'm happy to talk more offline, either via email or phone, about that specific case. But in general, I would say that the regrouping is finding your allies, thinking about what worked and what didn't, and then going at every level, from community, the news media, those politicians, those schools, those professional organizations, to regroup and rethink about how to do better next time. I know that is an incomplete answer, and I wish desperately that I had more concrete things that I could promise will definitely work tomorrow or next week or next month. Some of this is the long slog of politics. Going back to supportive states, similarly to supportive districts, continue to share your stories, call for those public statements, hold those schools and districts to their policies, so that if something is happening, you are making sure that the policies that are in place or the laws are in place are being protected. And then someone else was responding, when you're losing at the state level, keep at it, but also think about focusing at the district and city levels. And I totally agree with that. Rebecca is jumping off the bus, stay safe, and reaching out about other California opportunities. And Chrissy is asking some folks to email. I would also say networking and engaging with other parents and families is really important in support of states, both so you have resources that you can tap into, and so if trans students or trans rights come under attack, you can mobilize more quickly. And again, this is some stuff that NCTE is working on as well. In those middling states where there maybe isn't explicit policies one way or the other, you really got to push your elected officials. And I love that, who was reading my mind? Diana was reading my mind. Cities and schools may be able to do changes even if the state isn't willing to. And going back to that networking and engaging in advocacy. The unsupportive states, and this is frustrating, is going to look very similar. Pushing elected officials, thinking about if change can happen at the city or district level, or maybe even the individual school or classroom level, even if the state isn't changing, and networking and engaging. And last but not least, lawsuits. Now, I want to be very clear that I am not recommending anyone sue, and I am not, unfortunately, NCTE does not have the ability to go to court with you. There are organizations that might. The ACLU has resources like that. Lambda Legal has resources like that. And I can't promise that your specific child or your specific story will be picked up by them, but you can sue, and that is an option that, again, more and more courts are siding with trans students, so it is a method of last resort. Any questions or any thoughts on any of that? The other thing I'm going to say about all of this, and I apologize for not having it on there. I'm going to write it down because I need to add it. So on slide number 42. All right. The other thing you can do is go to the media. And that can sometimes be a step even before a lawsuit of saying, this is something that we're going to talk to the media about. NCTE and I can help you with that. I can't promise we can get your story out, but I can definitely try and help get that story out. And someone was asking about the recent case in Pennsylvania, which again, now Betsy is reading my mind because that's coming up in a couple slides. So I'm going to hold off on that for 1 second, Betsy, and then I'll share the information I have. I will also follow up with our policy folks to talk about the ramifications more broadly. So in thinking about what's next, the first thing I want to remind everyone is self-care. And I want to introduce you to Dr. McSnuggles. I do not know if Dr. McSnuggles is the cat, the dog, or if they are both licensed medical practitioners. But I want to remind everyone about self-care, not only in the way we all talk about it, of getting enough sleep and getting enough exercise and eating right and all of those things that we all know we should do, but we don't always do. But giving ourselves permission to not try and do everything. I'll give an example. My mom texted me yesterday really excited because she was going to go to a rally in Chicago tonight. And she texted me today saying it's raining and freezing and does she have permission not to go? And I said, well, you don't need my permission to go or not, but absolutely you have my permission not to go. We want to make sure that we are engaging in a way that's sustainable over the long haul and that we aren't doing things today that are going to bite us in the butt tomorrow. So self-care can sometimes mean, actually, I don't have the capacity to do an interview, or actually, I'm not up for the rally this weekend, or I can't speak at the city council meeting. It doesn't mean, hopefully, that you'll never do any of those things, but you have my permission, very, very specifically, you have my permission to back off if you need to catch your breath. And Kimberly is saying you can't fill from an empty cup. That's not a phrase I've heard before, but I love it, Kimberly, and I totally agree. You need to make sure that you are taking care of yourself. And as I said, that doesn't mean only taking care of before you engage in advocacy, but also thinking about how you want to engage in self-care after you've done that rally or protest or city council meeting or whatever. Any other thoughts on self-care? Anything people have found particularly helpful or not helpful? Any suggestions? And there's 10 million things you can Google about this, so I don't want to belabor the point, but if anyone has a specific thing that they've found really useful, I would love to hear it. I want to take a moment to think about the what ifs. And what I mean by that is, what if something negative happens? What if something happens to your family or your child or your community? The very first thing I would say is, again, protect your family, making sure that you are engaging in a way that feels safe. You are locking down your social media profiles. You are picking and choosing when and how you want to share your name or your photo. And again, there's no right or wrong there. There are some amazing advocates who use their real name and real photo. There are some amazing advocates who use a real first name and a fake last name and only use photos from the back or from the side. And there are some advocates who are doing incredible, important work who aren't public at all. And it is up to you with your family what's going to be the right fit there. I would also say connecting with each other is really important to make sure that you're continuing to engage in these support groups. And someone is saying in group settings, we always start with check-ins, give everyone 3 to 4 minutes to tell the rest of the group how they're feeling and doing. And that can be really powerful, to have that space to say, I'm doing great, and have everyone cheer with you, or to say, I'm actually not doing so hot, and have everyone commiserate with you. This is another space where you can engage with media. If something, knock on wood, happens to you or to your family, this is a space where getting that story out can be really powerful. Getting it out on social media, which anyone can do, and getting it out through more traditional media, which NCTE can certainly give you some resources for, and hopefully, depending on what else we have on our fires, can help more actively. So I would always want to connect with you. And then, again, if it feels like it's appropriate, and I'm happy to brainstorm, not in this call right now, but brainstorm about this with anyone, is it time to reach out to the ACLU or GLAAD or Lambda Legal or NCLR or TILDEF or TILSON or TLC or PFLAG or any of the other organizations that are out there? So then thinking about what's next is we're thinking about what else is coming. So as I said, we're going to stay tuned for Gavin Grimm's case. That's going to be heard on the 28th with results hopefully by the end of June. And then there are other lawsuits happening. So someone mentioned earlier, there was a win in Pennsylvania yesterday where a federal district court ruled in favor of 3 clients of Lambda Legal. And these were students who were young trans women who had been told they weren't allowed to use the women's room. And the court ruled in favor of Lambda Legal's injunction that immediately halted the enforcement of a discriminatory policy of the school district. My understanding, and I'll double check with our policy folks, is that this initial ruling only directly affects that school, and that the final ruling would affect that district. However, and I mean federal district rather than school district. However, these cases are also always helpful in terms of precedent and in terms of even when other courts aren't obligated by that precedent, if they're in a different district, they will still look to each other to hopefully try and stay consistent. So I'm happy to follow up if there are folks on this call from Pennsylvania who are curious, or from the same district, federal district, who are curious about their specific school districts. I unfortunately don't have that knowledge myself, but I'll absolutely include it in the follow-up email that I'll send out later this week. We also want to keep working on coalition building, and that's something that calls like this are really exciting about, those Facebook groups are really exciting about, and that NCTE and other organizations are working on doing more of. So if there are resources you know would be helpful, we talked about those template letters earlier that I absolutely want to put together. If there are other resources you know would be helpful, please let me know. And if we don't have them or other orgs don't have them, we'll see if we can put them together. There are other protests happening around the country as well, and that's something I would stay tuned into. Again, as I gave my mom permission, it doesn't mean that you need to go to all of them, but attending 1 or 2 can really make a difference and can be an incredible, powerful show of support. And there are questions right now in progressive spaces of how important are protests, how important are rallies, what do they do? And I would say that they are important alongside all of this other stuff. If we are only protesting or only going to rallies, that's not going to change school district policies. But if we are protesting and meeting with legislators and meeting with school teachers and talking to the administration and getting our story out in media and making sure that we're engaging with other parents and finding allies, and voting, and calling other people to do all of those things, absolutely, protests and rallies are an important part of that. And on that note, thinking about the June 11th Pride March in DC, this is still forming because it was coming out of the Women's March that people wanted to put together a Pride March or a Pride Rally in DC on June 11th. So it's still not entirely sure what it's going to look like, but at the very least it should be a ton of people supporting LGBT rights. And if you are in the area, that's certainly something to think about putting on your calendar. Someone had a question, how do we better structure our parent groups to talk less about our stories and more about our advocacy? I don't want to be rude, but I think our support group has become comfortable because we live in a supportive state. I think that's an awesome question, and I'm writing it down. The initial thing I would say is thinking about the language you use to describe the group. Are you calling it a support group or an advocacy group? Are you being really clear about what the expectations are coming in and giving space to parents who are maybe newer to trans identity who need that support, but also giving space to parents who are interested in more active advocacy? Beyond that, I'd be really curious what other parents or educators or advocates have to say, either, and I'll unmute folks if they want to say it that way, or if you want to share in the chat window. I would love to hear from other parents about how you are moving support groups into an advocacy position. All right, then I would say that's an open-ended question and one that I'll include in my follow-up email. So if people have additional thoughts on that, please let me know and I'll share those out. In terms of what's, so someone was responding, our support group has a closed Facebook group for the parents in the group. Some people post their advocacy efforts on the Facebook group. So providing that in-person support space and then a digital space where there can be more advocacy. And I think a natural extension of that would be maybe alternating weeks, or saying we're going to have our support group on Mondays and we're going to have a once-a-month advocacy group on Thursdays to write letters or make signs or that sort of thing. Someone else is chiming in. In a college GSA, we had one part of the meeting for support and another for advocacy. I love that idea too, of being able to give people that space if they need it, and also look towards more advocacy and look towards more action. In terms of NCTE's plans, we definitely want to do more workshops like this. And if there are things you're looking for tools or for training, please let me know. And if we don't already have them planned, I'll see if we can make them happen. We're also interested in coalition work with other organizations, both within the LGBT community and outside of it. So one of the things that is both exciting and can be scary in the trans community is we are also immigrants, and we are also people of color, and we are also disabled, and we are also undocumented, and we are also economically disadvantaged, and we are also at risk for bad healthcare outcomes. And so we want to make sure at NCTE that when we're doing our work, we're also supporting all of the other communities that support us. We also want to be able to provide more messaging resources. So I love all of the questions that have already come up, and that I'm sure more will come up in terms of how do we respond when a school says this, or how do we talk to a parent who has a fear about this, or how do we connect with media when they're portraying things this way. So again, if you have questions or thoughts, or if someone in a PTA meeting said something that really pissed you off and you weren't sure how to respond, please let me know. I can guarantee you're not the only person to want that messaging, and we want to make sure you have it. And then we also want to stay connected. That goes into some of the coalition stuff we've planned, and making sure that we are able to respond to what you need. So again, if there are questions or thoughts or comments in your community, I definitely want to hear about them. In terms of next steps that you can take, some of you I've connected with already about telling your stories. If you are interested, you can go to the Share Your Story form, which is in the upper right of NCTE's website, which is transequality.org, and we can connect about your story. No one is ever obligated to share their story, so emailing me or scheduling a phone call can be, I'm not sure about this, I want to brainstorm about it, and we can talk about pros and cons. I can also connect you with other parents who have shared their stories in different ways and who have agreed to talk through some of the pros and cons of being out in public or being partially out and anonymous or everywhere in between. If there are no more questions or thoughts right now, I love all of the chat asking for more workshops, and I definitely want to continue to offer more workshops. We're going to do more of the ones we've already offered, so story training and advocacy, stuff like this. We also have some more that we're working on other topics. So if there is a specific topic you know you need support on, please let me know, and we'll see if we can put together a workshop around it. Someone was asking, does NCTE work with the Gill Foundation? So the Gill Foundation is a really amazing funder that does a lot of work, particularly out of Colorado, which is where Tim Gill is from, as well as around LGBT work around the country. And NCTE is a fundee of the Gill Foundation, so we definitely are friends with the Gill Foundation. Does NCTE have student right handouts that are suitable for teens? We don't, and that should definitely exist. So if I can't find it, we will make one. So handouts on rights for teens. I want to say that I've seen stuff like that on GLSEN's website, and I'll see if I can hunt up some resources to include in the follow-up email. But if I can't, we absolutely need those resources, and I would love to put those together and work with parents and advocates to make that happen. So for the follow-up email, I will send that definitely by the end of this week, maybe not tomorrow, but definitely by Friday. That's going to include the video of this slideshow, which will be the slides and the audio. I think of just me. I don't know that anyone else chimed in. It'll also include the slide deck itself if you want to pursue it, because a 90-minute YouTube video is not always the most helpful way to review material. I'm going to include a bunch of the resources that we talked about, both PDFs and web links, and as much as I can, answers to some of the questions that came up. So about resources in Spanish, about lists of books, about the Pennsylvania cases, as well as stuff that maybe was unanswered to see if anyone else has resources around it. There was another question, is there anything families with more than one trans youth or trans family member bear in mind when telling their stories? I can imagine families like that may be perceived differently compared to a family with one trans member. That's a really great question too, and I don't have an answer for that. It does seem like that definitely could come up with different questions around, well, why do you have more than one trans person in your family, or what did you do, or that sort of thing, which I hope we all know are unfair and unreasonable questions, but that's something that we should definitely come up with some language around so that families who are in that situation can have some language in their back pocket. So I'm going to write that down. And someone else asked, do you have any materials for schools when they change principals? Ooh, that's a tricky question. I'm assuming, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that what you specifically mean is if a school has a supportive policy and then a new principal is coming in and being asked to continue that policy. And that, I think, is a great question. I haven't seen messaging resources specifically around that or resources for principals around that, but that's a great question, and let me ask around and see if we can come up with anything. Any other thoughts or questions or comments before we call it a night?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yay. Hi. My family, we're in Berkeley, and we've been working with the San Francisco Chronicle for the last 8 months to do this documentary-style story that they got connected to us through Gender Spectrum. And Diane Ahrensbath and Rosenthal at UCSF Gender are also part of the story. So my question to you, because it was supposed to come out in November and now it's going to be coming out in March, my question is how can we make the most of this so it's all of this energy and time, and it's going to be really well done with great experts? How can I help get this far and wide? Like, is there something if I email you, or what would you recommend?
Absolutely. I would say in general for moving into sort of an elevated media coverage space. So first, thinking internally, thinking about Facebook profiles and Twitter and the extent to which you want some of that information that's maybe no one cared about before if people are looking for it. So being sure that you are taking care of your family first and foremost. In terms of helping getting that story out there, at the very least, NCTE loves sharing things out on social media, and that we can definitely do. And I would say I'm happy to connect you with some other parents who have had similar sort of media exposure boosts where they were doing...
Yeah, Vanessa was going to connect me with you, but I think she's been very busy lately. But yeah, I think that would be really helpful.
Okay, so I will certainly think about that. And I'm happy if you shoot me an email, I'm happy to schedule a call to sort of go more in depth and brainstorm with you.
Great, thank you so much. My name's Sarah.
All right, I will look out for that email, Sarah. Check, and someone is saying check with StoryCorps as well, and that's a organization and a project that I certainly love and always love people going to.
Okay. Yeah, because it's going to be a front page on a Sunday and then continue to front page on Monday and be online as well. So they're really trying to push it, and hopefully it's really well done. Fingers crossed.
Exciting. Any other questions or thoughts before we call it a night? All right. Well, I want to thank everyone for taking this time and for giving me some curveball questions. I love having questions that I don't know the answers to because then I get to go learn more stuff. Again, I will share this video out and all of those resources we discussed in the next couple days. And please, please, please do tell me if there's more things that you're looking for or anything else I can do for you. And as a trans person who has been supported by some amazing parents and amazing advocates, please keep up the good work.